Good afternoon. It is my pleasure to have the opportunity to moderate our panel on the future of rooftop solar with an emphasis on net energy metering policy. It's been an interesting few months around this topic. We have two very well-respected experts in their fields who will be our participants. And I encourage you to take a look at their bios, which are outlined in the packet that you received upon registration. They bring very different perspectives. And through this debate, we hope to educate, stimulate, and further explore one of the most controversial topics being debated in the clean energy community right now. So the topic, the future of rooftop solar. In July of 1997, Nevada approved its first net metering legislation, and it provided for a capacity of 10 kilowatts and a maximum of 100 customers in each of the 2 utility territories in the state. I'd call that a very humble beginning. As we fast forward, on August the 20th, 2015, at 8 p.m. approximately, according to local news accounts, Nevada hit the recently approved 235 megawatt cap on net metering. This made Nevada, as I understand it, the first state to technically end a program that had been in place for such a long period of time. Earlier today, in his opening remarks, our U.S. Senator Harry Reid indicated, and I quote, "It is clear that distributed energy, energy storage, and other sources of electricity and efficiency are competing with utility-scale power plants as they should. This fact cannot be ignored." And indeed, the facts cannot be ignored. U.S. solar has increased 418% since 2010, and more than half of this increase comes in the form of solar panels on homes and businesses. 44 states and the District of Columbia have authorized net metering, and nearly 60% of our utilities across the country are currently reviewing their net metering policies. Allow me to welcome to the stage our 2 speakers for our debate. Let me welcome Charlie Cicchetti, who is the Senior Advisor for Pacific Economics Group. Welcome, Charlie.
Thank you.
And let me welcome Lisa Wood, the Executive Director for the Institute for Electric Innovation and the Vice President of the Edison Foundation. Welcome, Lisa.
Thanks, Rose.
I love this desk. I feel like Candy Crowley. Let me talk a little bit about the format as our speakers prepare themselves. Each will be provided the opportunity to give you a 3-minute introduction. We'll then go into a Q&A for approximately 15 minutes, and we hopefully will include a couple of rapid-fire questions. Then each of the participants will be provided the opportunity for closing statements, and then I have the opportunity to do a quick wrap. So let me then turn this over to you, Mr. Cicchetti, for your opening statement.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. Thank you all for having me here. Let me start out with a news flash. There is no requirement for customers to buy electricity from utilities. And there's certainly no precedent to require customers who choose not to buy electricity from their utility to pay for it anyhow. And I think it's really important to keep that basic idea in line, because you can't understand the issues that are involved in the net metering debate and even the distributed generation debate, in my opinion, as long as we maintain the false notion that there's a duty to buy what the utility is selling. I want to talk about 3 fundamental issues today. The first is that the electric industry is now telling the world, and I doubt some of their math and some of their analysis, that they can build renewable energy for half the cost of what customers can spend or would spend to place it on their rooftops. Two questions have to be asked. The first is, cheaper for whom? And recall when you answer that question, the second issue, which is that half of something, where I come from, is always more than nothing. And I say that because when customers pay to install solar units on their rooftops, the system's not paying, the utility system and their customers are not paying for that installation. The second thing that's happening out there is that many utilities are going out and starting to challenge net metering. And they're doing it by calling it a rich man's subsidy. They're ignoring some of the demographics of who's putting solar rooftops on and how leasing program has extended the installations of solar rooftops on moderate family rooftops. But the most important thing is what they're trying to do is to make it seem that the customer generator is selling electricity to the utility. That's not what net metering is about. Net metering is about placing customer generation in a bank, much like we place our money in a bank. And when you do that, what's really going on out there is a situation where the utility gets to use that electricity in the meantime, but the customer has the right to call it back. This is not a sale. This is not about avoided costs. It's not about whether it's cheaper to get it some other way. This is simply about the world in which we bank electricity that belongs to the customer, is never sold to the utility, and the customer, under reasonable terms and conditions, can call it back. Finally, I'll maintain throughout my presentation today that most of the tariff changes that we're hearing about around the country are unfair, discriminatory, anti-competitive, and self-serving because they're all about going out there to try to allow the utilities to guarantee their revenue recovery. Thank you.
Thank you, Charlie. Lisa.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. And thank you, Senator, for inviting me to participate in the 8th Annual National Clean Energy Summit. I'm delighted to be here, and I can tell this is going to be a really fun debate. Before we get started, I'm curious, how many of you in the audience already have or would like to have solar on your rooftops? A lot of you, and I'm not surprised here in Nevada. In the US, solar energy is a megatrend. We love solar. It produces carbon-free electricity, and for the most part, it produces energy when we need it during the day. What makes all of this solar growth possible is the power grid. The power grid is vitally important. It powers everything we do. Today, the power grid is already integrating a diverse set of renewable energy resources. As Geisha Williams said earlier from PG&E, one of them is rooftop solar. In states like Hawaii, California, Arizona, and right here in Nevada, we are witnessing exponential growth in rooftop solar. There's no question. Solar is a critically important part of our energy future. I'd like to use some of my time today to address some of the myths and facts about solar. One common myth is that the utility industry is not committed to solar. I'm pleased to report to you that the electric utility industry today is leading the way on solar. Utility-scale solar projects amount to nearly 60% of all installed capacity in the US, and that's expected to triple by the end of 2016. In addition, the industry is expected to invest about $9 billion per year over each of the next 5 years. That's $9 billion with a B. You heard about some of those projects earlier today from Jim Hughes, the CEO of First Solar, and some of them are right here in Nevada. Another common misconception is that rooftop solar customers don't need the power grid. Actually, rooftop solar customers use the grid 24/7 to import power, to export power, and to make sure that their homes have the exact amount of electricity they need at every moment of the day to power all of their devices. I think it's only fair that rooftop solar customers who use the grid continue to pay for the grid. You may also be hearing that the grid gets in the way of rooftop solar. Not so. The grid integrates, connects, and supports rooftop solar. For example, even at peak output, rooftop solar systems need the support of the grid to start large motors. That means on a hot day like today, the grid connection is what allows rooftop solar owners to turn on their air conditioners. And finally, some of you may be hearing that today's net energy metering policies work just fine. The fact is, regulators across the US, and Rose mentioned this earlier, whose mandate is to protect all customers, recognize that decades-old net energy metering policies need to be updated to ensure that electric rates are fair and that unreasonable cost shifts do not occur. State regulators are already changing these policies. The bottom line, I agree with Nancy Fund. This is the golden age of solar. So let's work together to get the policies right, especially the net metering policies. I look forward to the discussion today.
Thank you. So, Lisa, you have written quite extensively on the need to appropriately address the issue of solar pricing and the valuations. You acknowledge the declining cost of DG, but you do reference these embedded subsidies, a lack of transparency, and there's also this conversation stemming from some of the folks that you represent that only affluent households have the opportunity to advance rooftop solar, and it's subsidized. So please elaborate.
Okay, so I'll start with the second part first. And I do believe that solar is becoming available to everyone. So because we have rooftop solar, we also have community solar, and we have large-scale solar. So that's the first part of it. The second part is what you're talking about is in reference to the net energy metering subsidy. And the net energy metering subsidy is very simply the failure of rooftop solar customers to fully pay for the grid services that they use. So I've written a few papers on that. That's what the net metering subsidy is. It is not transparent, because if you ask people if they have a subsidy, they will say, of course I don't have a subsidy. I have net metering.
So that being said, if the subsidy is focused on the lack of equitable payment for the excess that's used, who has a responsibility for figuring that out? Where's that calculation supposed to take place?
Okay, the subsidy is a result of rooftop solar customers not fully paying for grid services that they use. So that part that's not paid for is subsidized, is basically pushed on to non-rooftop solar customers. So who's supposed to take care of that? It's who's supposed to take care of that is what we're seeing today across the country in many states, where regulators are re-examining net energy metering policies because they recognize the cost shift and they recognize that it's unfair, and they're trying to do something about it.
So Charlie, Lisa is using terminology like cost shift, and she's saying that there's an embedded subsidy in the way net metering is currently structured. Do you think we've adequately acknowledged or properly quantified what you describe in your writings as the benefits of rooftop solar? Is it really a disruptive force? Give me some of your thinking on her view of cost shifts and subsidies.
I can't disagree with Lisa's position more. And the reason why is that the grid, which is really mostly the distribution system that we're talking about, that grid for most utilities has already been paid for. In fact, it's probably been paid for multiple times. So when we talk about the fairness of it, we have to start to raise, in my mind, the question of what are the costs of the grid that we're talking about. I wouldn't maintain a reasonable position to say you should pay nothing to bank your electricity and withdraw the electricity. But the premise ought to be that the utility is selling 1 kilowatt hour of electricity to a customer who doesn't have solar. They should get the revenue for that 1 kilowatt hour. The problem I have with most of what the utilities are saying is they also want quite a bit of revenue, maybe almost as much, for the kilowatt hour that the person who puts the solar rooftop on is using it themselves. And it's really important to understand the way the math flows back and forth. The second problem I have is that they don't stop there. They want the customer who has the solar rooftop system in place. Let's say they have 7 kilowatts of electricity on their rooftop. They want to look at that customer's maximum demand. Let's say it's 8 kilowatts. They want to charge for the 8 kilowatt use of the grid when you're only going to be using that grid with that solar rooftop in place of maybe a kilowatt, maybe not even a kilowatt. So they're really talking about multiple charges for something that's probably already been paid for. In California, not only has the distribution system been paid for, but the California utilities are actually pre-collecting money to dismantle, replace, and rebuild the system. So customers have to pay attention to the numbers, they have to pay attention to the facts. And I think when they do, we'll decide that utilities should only get 1 kilowatt hour revenue for 1 kilowatt hour of the electricity that they go out and supply. And they should get virtually nothing other than maybe a handling fee for the kilowatt hour of electricity that the customer is storing on their system and the utility is using in the meantime to supply other customers. And then in return, those customers are getting back that electricity from the utility when they decide that they may need some additional electricity.
All right, so Lisa, we didn't build in, we really didn't build into our format sort of a rebuttal, but I hope you understand that rebuttal is welcome. But if you could do so in the context of something that, again, that I read, you described distributed generation as a, quote, desirable public policy, but you warn of the unintended consequences. One of the things I need you to speak to, given your constituency, is what Senator Reid raised earlier around the current business model of the utility. How are we going to address some of the questions that you raise within our current model? So the business, is it a good fit for the growing customer needs, the choices that they're making?
Yeah, I think it's a very good fit. And what I would say is the problem, okay, the issue around net metering and today is, again, the net metering policies are being restructured in many states across the US because regulators are concerned about the cost shift. That policy is changing as we speak, even in Nevada as we speak. But I want to also go back to the grid. Utility industry spends about $20 billion a year on the grid. So I would say we are investing in the grid, Charlie, and I think you know how the grid works. You know that if I have rooftop solar, I import energy, I export energy, and I also have to balance supply and demand every hour and minute of the day. Your rooftop solar system's not doing that. The grid's doing that.
I don't dispute the balancing charge. I don't dispute the transaction costs that are involved. But I didn't answer the moderator's question initially when she asked me about benefits. And this is where I bring the benefits. When we have distributed generation that customers pay for on their rooftops, when we have that, we now see under the Clean Power Plan that hopefully gets through the courts and stays in effect. When that Clean Power Plan goes into effect, states will be able to count the renewable energy that customers pay for as part of the renewable portfolio standard. That will save, in my opinion, far more money than the additional costs that are involved in any transaction fees, any of the costs that might be involved in balancing the grid. And when we talk about the grid, we have to understand what part of the grid that we're using when we're talking about exporting and importing energy. It's more the distribution end of the system, in my mind, than the transmission end, because centralized solar and centralized power plants use a lot more investment in terms of moving their electricity from where it's generated to where a customer's load happens to be.
So we're going to try to move into a little more of a rapid response here. But Lisa, the distributed generation community and advocates are frequently told that the market can't be sustained without incentives and subsidies and extra programs. Do you concur with that assessment? And Charlie, I'm going to ask you to respond to that. And you've got a minute.
Okay. I think what we've seen over the last 5 years is we've seen the cost of solar come way down. And I think that the subsidies that have been in place, the investment tax credit, the state subsidies, and net metering have all had a role in that. And just like we do with technologies, lots of technologies that we want to proliferate, we create subsidies. And when those costs come down far enough, when they're competitive, then we let the market take over. We're still in a place where we have subsidies, and those subsidies make sense. So I think it's a humongous success story. I mean, when you look at the declining costs for solar.
So I want to come back to the issue of subsidy again for your constituents, but do you want to respond?
Yeah, so I think the framework is different. I think there's no question solar is increasing. There's no question that the costs of solar are coming down and that innovation is taking place. And batteries will make that, in my opinion, even more cost effective and something we see. But the whole idea of a subsidy is when we think that the framework we should be thinking about is the utility. It's not the utility. It's the energy sector. It's the innovation that comes when people go out and do something to break away from the utility, when they go out and do something that's in their economic interest and it also has some societal benefits. When we look at the benefits, it's hard to think of this as a subsidy. And even if we were, in my opinion, and we call it a subsidy, it's fully justified because the benefits far outweigh the cost of whatever those so-called subsidies might be.
Okay. So Lisa, quickly on that point, to be clear, when we're talking about net metering and this built-in subsidy that you described, again, focused on that delta. I produce power, and yes, I have a 17 kilowatt solar system on my home, so I can sit in the middle of this and have this conversation. Okay. I produce the power. What I don't use, we're talking about the delta. We have a regulatory regime that takes a look at that, and they make a decision as to the valuation. Are we moving toward pricing discussion that you feel is equitable?
Well, I want to address the elephant in the room. The elephant in the room is not the amount of solar energy that is sold back into the grid. That's actually usually a fairly small amount. The elephant in the room is the solar customer using the grid 24/7 and not paying for grid services, which is a result of just legacy rate making. And that's what we're seeing that starting to change.
Okay, legacy rate making. Regulatory proceedings, you do a lot of that.
I do.
Okay, is that where we are?
I hope not, because I view what's going on now and before regulatory commissions as more of a pushback and a slowdown of the progress that's been made. I think what we really have to understand that if carried through to its completion, it's going to mean that customers are going to go completely off the grid. There'll be no contribution of any fixed costs. There'll be no contribution to any of the costs that help keep other customers' bills reasonably priced. I think that we're going to see storage. I think people will bring their Tesla automobiles or other electric vehicles up and use them for storage. I think we'll see breakthroughs in innovation on the storage front that will detach customers from the grid. And I don't think that's good for everyone. I think that there's room in here for a sensible solution. And I'm afraid that the legacy and other rate case filings that are out there are really causing a gap where people are going to say, there's another solution, and it's called going off the grid.
So I'm going to let you continue to your final statement. I know we have one question here from Twitter. I can't believe how fast this half an hour is gone. But could you supplement your final statement and sort of cut it in half? So I'm going to go to Lisa and allow her to have the last word.
Sure. Thank you all for listening to me. I want to change topics and make a plea, a request. And that is that we don't let renewable energy, net metering, and distributed generation become a wedge issue. We're in the middle of a political campaign. It seems a bit early. And I think we have to understand that the best way to understand this is about choice. No political party should be against that. It's about getting cleaner environment, and nobody should be against that. And certainly the party that I'm in, the Republican Party, which I'm not here to endorse or make a statement of, that's the party that brought us national parks and wilderness areas. It's also the party that brought us EPA. We should not let this whole issue about worrying about these issues become one where it's a partisan issue. It should be an all-American issue. We should all stand behind it, and we should encourage people who take the time and make the effort to go out and invest in the resources that allow them to have renewable energy on their rooftops. Thank you.
Lisa.
Thank you for listening to my comments. We need to get the policies right, and getting it right to me means two things. First is collaboration, not confrontation. Electric utilities, regulators, and other stakeholders absolutely need to work together to ensure the energy future that we want. Some states have initiated collaborative efforts. Minnesota is one example, the E21 initiative, a voluntary collaborative effort to find the way forward to a 21st century energy future. I assure you, and this is where I agree with Charlie, adversarial rate proceedings will not produce the vision of our energy future that we all want. Second, the electricity grid is an essential infrastructure for our nation. When we flick the switch, the lights go on. That means that the grid works instantaneously to power all of your devices all of the time, no matter how much or how little energy you use. It does that for 115 million households across the US, plus all of our businesses and industries. Much of the debate around net energy metering and rooftop solar boils down to just one simple thing: ensuring that all customers who use the grid pay for this essential service. And I'll leave you with one example. Ontario, Canada. Regulators implemented policies this year to bill customers directly for the full cost of the distribution grid. That's called transparency. That means that all customers who use the grid pay for the grid. That's one example of a way forward. In closing, I think we can all agree that solar power is an important part of our energy future. Let's focus on collaboration, not confrontation, and let's work together to get the policies right. Thank you.
So I have the red sign. I want to thank our speakers or panelists and ask you to help me thank them for their candid assessments of net metering. As we exit the stage and you exit, knowing what's coming later this afternoon, you know where I'm going with this. When you get up, you are to exit. This does not mean to chat, even though I'm sure you have much to chat about, because it's time for the Secret Service sweep. Please take all of your bags with you. Recognize that when you come back into the room, you will be required to go through TSA-like security. So if you need to get rid of any extras, please use your time to do that. Enjoy your lunch. Thank you for your time and attention. Good afternoon.